Bob Greaves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. And it's good to be back with you here at the beginning of the year. Happy New Year. I'm feeling okay today, but yesterday I was not feeling at all well. I went out for dinner on New Year's Eve, and it was okay. Went out with some friends of ours. It was good to spend some time with them. But I was not feeling all that well all night, actually. And then it came time for the ball to drop as we were watching it on TV, and we had our champagne, and I took just a sip of the champagne, and it didn't seem all that good. And I took another sip, and it hit my stomach like a rock, and I was like, "Oh, I don't feel good." And so I was all the way up until about almost 6 in the morning. I felt like, oh no, I hope I don't barf, whatever. Anyway, but anyhow, so yesterday I was mostly recovering from that. I don't really know what was going on, but I'm not a wild partier anyway. So, but anyhow, Happy New Year. I guess for me, the good news is that the year can only get better. So it starts off, at a low point, so I can nothing but higher points there on after, I guess. Anyhow, we made it to the new year. We didn't get destroyed on that one prediction of Mayan horror. There was no apocalypse of zombies that came for us, whatever. But here we are. And by the way, up here in Binghamton, New York, we are just covered in snow. It's starting to melt a little bit, but I've had as much as 12, 15 inches of snow in places where it has fallen, just a ton of snow, and it's very bitter cold up here. But hey, we're surviving. Anyway, tonight I'm hoping to talk a little bit about the clarity of terms. And I wanted to talk about this because this is something that is a question that often comes up, and it's a question that comes up with a lot of people over a lot of things. We all have to, in our lives, start to make sense of the world and of the universe in some way or another. And we all develop perhaps a unique way of doing that without ever really stopping to ask certain questions about whether or not the way we approach things is even legitimate or not. For example, when I was studying linguistics, one of the things that was humorous to me was the fact that oftentimes linguists get into little spats with grammarians because both of them study language, but both of them have oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes they have a very different sense of what language is. Some people who are grammarians, not all, have this notion that words actually have meaning, and they love dictionaries. They read dictionaries in their spare time, some of them. They have favorite dictionaries. They have dictionaries they think more accurately define what a word really means, and things like that. Whereas linguists, we're a little sloppier than that. We're quite sloppy. In fact, for a linguist, the meaning of a word it's sufficient if more than 50% of the population uses it in a particular way. That's enough to consider it a regularity of sorts. And we don't think that words actually have meaning. We think that they get used. People assume that they possess a certain meaning, and they mean something when they use it, but they mean what they think it means, not necessarily what it does mean. And so, therefore, when we're trying to understand words in a language, we're really not all that interested in, well, what should it mean? Well, people use the word. How do they use the word? Whether that's right or wrong or correct or incorrect or according to the rules or not according to the rules isn't the point. People use the word, and they use it in a certain way, and they use it in sometimes various certain ways. And sometimes there's actually even predictable issues surrounding the event of usage that allows us to determine what the meaning might be in any particular usage. And so, there's this little spat. So some approach even the question of language as if it is a thing in and of itself that can be known with certainty. And others approach it as something that's kind of fast and loose, where we really have to kind of hunt for probabilities and likelihoods and things like that. And so there's just not that kind of certainty going with it. And this is true with a lot of things. There's a lot of people who think, for example, when it comes to being normal, well, is this normal? And they don't even understand what normal means. And a lot of people don't understand what normal means. A lot of people use the word normal. And so when we're using the word normal, just as people who speak language based on usage, many times when we use the word normal, we mean, healthy, appropriate, according to design or something like that. But technically, the word normal, when we're defining it with a dictionary or when we're defining it as statisticians, the word actually means that which is the norm, that which is done by the greatest modality of people. And so that might be, if we live in a very violent society, then it's normal to be violent in that society because that's what the norm does. So normal doesn't actually really mean. Now, this brings out another confrontation that we have about, are things nailed down to the floor, or are they just kind of fast and loose? But this is one of the reasons why many different fields of study have to do what they have to do. We call it nomenclature. In many fields of study, we take certain terms and we define them rigidly. And it's not necessarily because in those fields that the people who go into them are rigid, people who like to put the world into a neat little package. Quite the opposite. Sometimes the reason why we define these terms is because we realize they can get fast and loose. And so we try to nail them down to the floor, not because we want everybody to use the words right, but because we want to be able to use the words and communicate with them things that we can rely on more so. And so, for example, I teach sound engineering, and we have a lot of terminology that we use. We talk about, rarefaction. We talk about compression. We talk about frequencies. We talk about a diffusion. We have a lot of terms that we use, and each of them are defined in specific ways. We even have compound phrases, things like, transmission loss, and we define decibels in a variety of different ways. And so we have all these terms, and we define them, some of them even defined mathematically, with actual measurements of certain known quantities and things like that. But we do that not because we live in this illusory fantasy that these words actually possess those meanings, and that's what those words are supposed to mean. So learn the language, damn it. That's not the idea. The idea is that, we're in that field of sound engineering. We're trying to accomplish certain things with the use of sound. And in order to do that, we need to use the equipment and the microphones and the recording devices and the distribution devices. And we need to have people who are hired to do certain things. We need to get these things accomplished. And so we need to standardize a lot of the things we talk about for the purposes of clearer communication. And the truth is, we use a lot of words that are used out in the normal population, and we don't try to tell the normal population they have to use the words the same way we do. In fact, most people in the normal population will use a word like reverberation or reverb. They think it's that dense, a multiple echoey sound that you always get when you hear the surfer guitar playing through that Fender amp, and just it sounds like it's coming through a canyon with all the echoing, or as if it came from a huge, large hall. And they think of that as reverberation. But sound engineers recognize that reverberation is actually any kind of sound that mimics the reflections of sound in any kind of room of any kind of size, and that's technically the way we use the term. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is that actually there is, in a sense, therefore, a professional use of language and a natural use of language. The general population doesn't have a language police that forces them to respect language in a particular manner. They just use it, and they use it very well and very effectively, and that's good enough for them. Professionals, many times, though, they have to deal with things where we can nail it down to the floor, and so for the sake of clarity, we standardize our language, and sometimes we even standardize it incorrectly. I guess I could use another sound term. Well, sometimes we talk about phase. The sound engineers talk about phase, and they talk about it in a way that's totally correct, in a way that's really totally technically incorrect. But it's too late. The terms are already used, and we have to use them in both ways. I don't know if I need to go into it specifically, but phase can talk about where in a particular sound wave it is beginning and ending. Is it actually beginning at no potential, and then increasing in its compression, and then decreasing in compression, going into rarefaction, all that other crap you don't necessarily know anything about. But we also use it to talk about a signal that has been mirror image, reversed in terms of its up and downness, and that is sometimes also called phase, but it really should be called polarity. But we call it phase, and so it's too late. If you buy a mixer and it has a button on it that says phase, it's really a polarity switch. But so those words, they do get. We have to technically know the wrong way to use the words correctly, as it were. Anyhow, the point I'm headed at is that when it comes to our faith, we live in a world where there's a professional language. And then there's just language, and this is similar in the church, as it were, in the spiritual world, if you want to call it that, where sometimes these terms take on meaning that they don't really have, or they get used in ways that weren't. That represents some sort of a distortion or diversion away from what they originally meant. Now, as a linguist, there's a part of me that says, well, that's fine. I mean, language is living, and it goes through its evolution. And as a linguist, when one studies a language over time, one learns to read that language differently based on what time period they're looking at, or what even area or dialect, or even sometimes right down to the very person, the way they use words differently. So the linguist isn't all that worried about the fact that the words may be used in different ways at different times by different people. But in a field of study, I guess it can be kind of weird. But when it comes to our faith, I think it's important that we realize that these words that we use have professional meanings that are not necessarily the way that we use these words. And then when it comes to denominations, sometimes the way these denominations have used those words, or reused those words, or repackaged those words, becomes their official definition of the term, and what have you. I would therefore also want to argue that in studying the professional terms, as it were, from the Bible, that there's this crazy notion that seems to exist. Many people believe this notion, believe it only because I never thought to not believe it. It just seem normal to them. If you grew up in America in our day, if you're listening to my voice, you grew up in this modern day where this religion was already around for quite a long time. And so by the time you've gotten old enough to actually be interested in listening to this broadcast, you've heard these words many, many, many times, and they have distinct, specific meanings for you. Words like saint, words like holy, words like repentance, words like faith. And we rarely take the time to even stop to think about, well, what do they really mean? How are they really used? But we've heard them so long that we make this false assumption very easily. That is, that we think that the original church, the original saints, as it were, we think that they used these words in just that way. As if the early church, whenever they heard the word repentance, they know exactly what that means and what the doctrine of repentance is. We have a comment already. This is awesome. The only reason we can say that words have meaning, if there is a reason at all, is because we've all agreed on its meaning. This is similar to economics and the value of a piece of paper. I would agree that it's a thing that gets negotiated and renegotiated. And not only that, but sometimes it slides into a new direction and people don't even realize it's sliding. I think an interesting example that we get from, say, the King James Version was the word, I'm trying to think of a couple of words that might be a good example. The word prevent. There was, these days, when most people use the word prevent, they use it in a way where what they intend to convey by that, the use of that word, is to engage in some sort of action or choice or decision or whatever that results in making something not happen or inhibiting it. Or somehow stopping it or not allowing it. That's usually the way we use the word prevent. But the actual original meaning of that word actually came from, in a sense, a military term. And that is one of the many military strategies that might be used would be if your enemy is going someplace and needs to maintain that place as a strategic point of strength, well, you might find it a better strategy to get there first. That way, if you get there first, they can't use that point as a strong point. A military strategist might sometimes seek to maintain certain areas that they need to conquer or take control of, not because those areas are good for them and their cause in the battle, but because those areas would be good for their enemy and their cause. And so by getting there first, you get there and you make it difficult for them to achieve their goal. And, when you get there first, when you venture out before they do, you prevent them. You venture before, you go there before they do. And so that word prevent was used in that way. And eventually the word prevent became, in a sense, a kind of a picturesque word, where we used it as a metaphor, that as if to inhibit somebody, you kind of beat them to the punch. You get there before they do. Wherever that symbolic strategy might be headed, whether or not we're actually talking about an actual place or an actual journey. And next thing you know, people are just using the word in a way where when we're using it now, a lot of people never stop to think about it. That when you meaning before, vent meaning to go, how does that mean to, stop something from doing? Well, it kind of evolved into that. It just changed over time. And nobody ever stopped to say, hey, did you know we're using this word wrong? It just happens. Languages always go through these changes. As a result, when you're reading English and you happen to come across that word prevent, you might want to know the date the item was written, because that could change radically what the word means. Makes me wonder sometimes. Koine Greek, which is the Greek of the New Testament, came into usage, I'd say about 300 years before Christ, and basically fell out of usage about 300 years after Christ. And that's some 600 years plus. That's a long time. Makes you wonder what sort of changes that language went through. We study languages today and we watch them go through changes. We look at the way they were written, say 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, and we see them go through changes. We do believe that because of the modernization, that two things are happening. That words that change through popular fad, they change rather quickly these days because of the population being much larger and times being much more fast-paced. But words which are stabilized through communication and official documents, they tend to stabilize because things have been in print for a while, and then new things happen. And words change for a variety of different ways. But we know enough about the way words change that when we take a look at that ancient Greek language, we don't know all of the answers, but we're pretty sure that that language experienced quite a variety of changes during its sojourn. Not only that, but in the days of Jesus, communication wasn't that strong. So consequently, there could be numerous regional changes that could happen to the way a word was used that just doesn't reflect the way that word is used in another region. And something a lot of people don't know about Koine Greek is that Koine Greek was not spoken in Greece. They spoke Greek there, and many of them kind of, they had a national pride, and some of them were kind of even offended at the idea that the entire kingdom spoke Greek. It was their language. And particularly after the Greek Empire fell and the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire eventually brings us all to Latin, I guess. But they used Greek because, why reinvent the wheel? When the Roman Empire rose, the entire area that they had conquered already spoke Greek, Koine Greek. So let's just keep it that way. And so they did. But regionally, there would be a number of differences. I wonder if some of the discrepancies that we have in the actual biblical text are not discrepancies that occurred because of errors in copying, but because when a particular document might have been copied and sent to another region, the person who made the copy to send to that region may have actually even been aware of regional differences in the way words were used, and that what we really have are dialectical translations of the New Testament in some of those variations that we have in the Greek New Testament. And there are a considerable number of variations that we look at. I think that if you were to, let me see here. I did a statistical analysis once, but if you had a Greek New Testament, this is the United Bible Society's Greek New Testament. Love it, Anyway, it's the one I tend to use more than any other. That there are, on average, 3 to 5 variations that are annotated on every page, of things that were different in this document and different in that document, different in this manuscript and that manuscript. And some where we have church fathers quoting it that tends to indicate that, wait a minute. There was some other word being used at one time. Anyway, there's a lot of variations that appear there. But I can't help but wonder, even, variations aside, these words must have changed in their usage over time. And it makes me wonder, the more professional words get, depends upon the time involved and whether or not there's actually professional people to use them. Even in rock and roll, in the 60s, if you had to develop professional nomenclature for rock and roll, it just wasn't rock and roll, I guess. But today, it is, Today, a lot of people who work in the music industry, even in popular music, they have their master's degrees in music theory from Berkeley and various other places, and they are people with sound engineering degrees, and they're people who are well educated in the theory of music, and they have all this education. It's amazing what's going on. Back in the '60s, if you could play a guitar and had a couple of cool tunes, you had a good shot at being a one-hit wonder. And today there's still that rebellious, fast and loose crowd that still produces a lot of popular hits. But in the industry itself, the industry is pretty much organized and controlled and managed by people who have, really got their act together, and it's down professional. And part of the reason for that is that, well, we've been doing this now for some 50 years and plus, and so it's become standardized, and we got a professional equipment, and it costs so much, and we're doing this, and we have distribution networks, and we got marketing networks, and we got PR people, we have artists and repertory people, and we got all kinds of, it's become quite a professional thing. And so many things have become standardized in terms of the way we even talk about the music. Well, when Jesus first came, Jesus never went through some process where he's trying to standardize the theology or trying to present the message that he was presenting in specific terms. When we read the Bible and we treat it as some sort of a resource book for all of the answers to our theological questions, we're trying to do this from a text that was never written by people who meant to do that. And it's not just they didn't mean to do it. It's not that, well, it's my opinion, they didn't mean to do it. That's not the movement hadn't been around long enough for any such professional language to actually develop. They didn't invent new words. They didn't come up with, say, a dictionary of Christian theological terms that was spread about so that when people happen to be able to get a chance to read some of these documents and letters and gospels, oh, okay, that's what you mean by this. Oh, this is what transfiguration is. Oh, this is what repent is. No, they didn't do it. They're just talking. They're just using words. So today, when we read our Bibles, a lot of the study things that we're using, a lot of the tools that we use are based upon the concept that some of these words have very specific meanings. Jesus was the propitiation for our sins. He was an atonement. He was, we have all these words, and we talk about the sovereignty of God. And we talk about some of these words that appear in the Bible, even the word the church, as if they had some specific, very distinct and theologically precise meaning, and as if, well, in the beginning they were all in agreement. No, they weren't. It didn't happen that way. The language was fast and loose. It was just the language of the realm, and they're merely communicating to each other about the marvelous experiences that had transpired as a result of this guy Jesus and the things that happened. Looks like we got more viewer comments here. Let's see, a viewer comment: the meaning of words change over time, but when someone writes a book or a letter like Paul did, it's like a camera taking a picture of what that word meant in a moment, and that meaning in that letter doesn't or shouldn't change. Well, that is, in a sense, an accurate statement, but it's also potentially a misleading one. It's true that when Paul uses a word, he didn't have a meaning intended. He is trying to say something. And it's also true that if we read that, we should try to read it and understand what he meant by it when he said it. The problem is and time goes on, and people use the word differently, and Paul isn't around any longer for us to say, okay, now, Paul, this word has been through this kind of an evolution. And I grant you this, most Christians have no clue how those words may have changed in meaning over time. So Paul isn't here for us to go back to him and say, now, you use this expression here, and we know that, there was a time when this expression was more used in this way and a time when it was more used in that way. And then there was a period of time where it even flip-flopped, where people used it sarcastically to mean just the opposite. So what did you mean, Paul, when you said this? He's not here to tell us or to clarify. And so although what you're saying is true, to actually know specifically what he meant by it is not as simple as, well, I'll just, I'll find my Wuest's word studies or my Kittle's Theological Dictionary of New Testament words, or I'll look in my concordance. Strong's number for that word is this one, and this means that, and blah, blah. So that's what Paul... That is not how language works, and that's not how Paul used language. And it's very likely that Paul says things differently from the way other apostles said things, not necessarily because he was of a different opinion, even though in some ways he may have been, no doubt, but because he would have said some of the same things in a very different way, and would have used different words choices because of the fact that words that he used may have meant something different to him than those same words used by Peter might have meant, or by James, and what have you. And so I agree with what the statement is trying to establish. And I would also even argue that to read the text, it's important that we be on a quest to understand the snapshot meaning that is present in the text. But the tools necessary for linguistically fettering that out require a little more rigor than most people might think. It's not impossible to do. Sometimes it is, but it's not. Sometimes it takes a great deal more work than you would think to try to actually fetter that out. Another viewer comment, Bob, how much of the translation in our English Bibles do you think we can rely on? How to answer that question without scaring you? I think you can rely on them entirely as being the opinion of somebody, of being an accurate translation, no doubt. But I don't think you can rely on any of it. And that's not to say that it's all garbage. I'm not saying that either. What I'm saying is that it's kind of like, don't let your guard down. There is no way of knowing to what degree or how much any particular verse may have been really radically distorted until you have done some very serious study of the original Greek. Now, one might argue, well, these translators have done some very rigorous study of the original Greek. Well, it might seem as though they have, and they have certainly been involved in rigorous study. But their rigorous study, more often than not, involved the rigorous study of acquiring the understanding of Greek as required by the organizations they're loyal to. And they weren't allowed to understand the Greek or to entertain notions about the Greek that were too far astray from official church doctrine, depending on what church they were in. And, so I think that we have to rely on the fact that our English Bibles have come to us having been through a process that has created an unknown degree of difficulty in maintaining clarity. I would argue this: anytime you are reading any word in the New Testament that is an official, professional word, that word's professional meaning is more likely than not only in the neighborhood of the idea that was actually being expressed. And the word was never used by the original authors in any kind of professional sense. And even Paul displays a style that shows that he actually changed his own style somewhat to speak to the people that he was speaking to. And so Paul had some sense of what these words would mean to his audience and used the words that he chose for that reason. This means that we'd want to not only study Paul in particular, but know something a little bit more about his audience in order to actually take a look at his letters, so that we might actually find his use of the word in one letter to actually be somewhat different, nuanced in his nuances, as he would use that same word in a letter to a different group. depending on what it was he did or did not know about that group. So we have these difficulties. How much of translation can we rely on? It's not as if you're going to read a verse that's talking about chocolate fudge, but what it's really talking about is atomic physics. It's not that wild, but it is very likely that there are times when there are certain, say, tongue-in-cheek phrases used that even to this day we have not yet discovered that was a tongue-in-cheek phrase. Doesn't mean really what it says. It really means to mock what it seems to be saying. There are things like that. So I think that rather than use the word rely, I think that we need to read the text with an eyebrow raised, aware of the possibilities and the difficulties, and with a little bit of humility, not be so dogmatic in terms of what it is we're concluding. Now, the church, by the time we get to the Latin Vulgate, is filled with a great deal of professional terminology. And Koine Greek lived as a usable language till about 330, AD, and so by that time, the church had gotten quite professional in its use of the terms, and it had also become quite anti-Semitic at times, so that not only were the words becoming professional, they were getting farther and farther away from their Jewish roots and deeper and deeper and deeper into a Greek philosophical background. Now, I am not going to say that Greek philosophy is inferior to Hebrew philosophy. That's not the point. The point would be that Greek philosophy is different from Hebrew philosophy. The ways of making sense of the world, the ways of making sense of language, the ways of making sense of, well, for example, description. In the Western world, it was more the habit in the Western world when describing something that we're actually trying to tell you what it looks like and what it is. That's how they used description. But in the Hebrew world, they didn't use description that way. That wasn't a problem for them. They weren't worried about that. That wasn't their concern. When they described something, they actually had an anti-philosophical attitude. They didn't know if anybody understood the way things really are or even need to. So consequently, when in the Hebrew language and in that culture, when they described something, they weren't telling you what it was. They were giving you something that's analogous to what it is so that you can relate to it as if that's what it is, and you'll do fine. That was great for them. In that language, description was used to tell you how to relate to something. And that was, okay, I'll relate to it as if it's this, What is it? Oh, who knows, But it's just that the language was focused very differently. Description had a very different purpose. So even if the text used description in helping us to relate to, say, God, and then later these things get translated, taken into the Greek culture, into the Western culture, and we read these descriptions, we say, oh, these are attributes of God. Yeah, right. No, it's wrong. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I don't know. But these words didn't come about originally by people who had any intention of trying to nail down the exact, accurate description of these concepts and ideas. That wasn't their purpose. It was good enough you could just relate. It's kind of like I was talking to somebody earlier this week about the difference between, say, philosophy and theology, or psychology and theology. I said, in psychology, I suppose the more you know about psychology, perhaps the better off you might be in learning how to deal with issues, learning how to deal with yourself, and understanding the dynamics going on inside of you. That might be helpful. But in actuality, the more you like yourself, respect yourself, feel adequate to life, and like other people, you're going to do pretty good. You're going to do very well. And you don't need to know all that psychological stuff. You don't even need to know the truth about all the dynamics going on inside of you. If you can accept yourself, if you can accept others, if you can seek to understand this vital love I was talking about in the last show, you're going to do just fine. You don't need to be an expert in psychology to live a meaningful and successful life. And in theology, I suppose it's a lot of fun. I enjoy it, trying to grasp the concepts of God and then understanding of what's really going on in the spiritual realm and all that other stuff. But, when it comes down to it, I suppose if you believe that God is with you, if you believe that he's there, if you believe that he loves you and adores you to no end and loves you, and has confidence in you and enjoys being the creator who knows you well, and you feel adequate to life, to be his child, you're going to do just fine. You're gonna work this through marvelously. So you don't need to be a professional human being. You don't need to be a professional Christian. That wasn't the goal. The thing was to have a meaningful relationship with yourself, your neighbor, and your God, one founded in love. Now, it makes me think about some of the terms that we use, and I realize that sometimes I use these terms, and all too often, even I will assume people know what is meant by them. So I was looking at a couple of the terms that were even floating around Facebook today, and thinking about some of them that I've used, and so I want to just take a moment to define a few of them. We use the word theist. A theist is somebody who believes in some sort of God. We don't know what. I mean, a Muslim is a theist if he believes in Allah. A Jew is a theist if they believe in Yahweh or Elohim or Adonai, however they might say it. Christians are theists if they believe in God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and things like that. People who believe in a God, they are theists. Atheists are not people. Many times people think that atheists are people who believe there is no God. That's not true. Now, many atheists don't believe there is a God, but that's like defining a human being as light-skinned people with blonde hair. Well, there are some human beings with light skin and blonde hair, yeah, but that's not what makes them human. That's not the defining feature of the genus species. What makes a person an atheist is that they're without God. They don't have a God they believe in. Is there a God? Technically, an atheist doesn't have to know or think about it. An atheist is an atheist because they're without God. So theism and atheism have more to do with your belief, what it is you embrace about the reality of a God. If there's a God that you embrace, you're a theist. And if there's no God that you happen to embrace, you're an atheist. One could even use the term loosely for a person who actually absolutely believes in God but doesn't worship him and doesn't have anything to do with him and doesn't want anything to do with him. They're without God. In a sense, that's a way the word could be used. Another word that I've used is agnostic. In fact, I've sometimes defined myself as an agnostic theist. And some people think that means I don't know what to believe, but that's not true. We got another viewer comment. Isn't defining a theist as someone who believes in a God just as restrictive? Oh, it might be, but we tend to use the word theist in reference to people who do believe in some sort of a God. I suppose believing in some sort of a God is in and of itself a restrictive experience, can be. And so but using the term that way as differentiating it from a person who doesn't believe in a God is the useful way we tend to use it. By agnostic, agnosticism doesn't have anything to do with belief. It has to do more with knowledge, and at least the way that I use it. When I call myself an agnostic, this does not mean that I don't believe in God. I do. It doesn't mean I don't have an experience that I embrace very genuinely and authentically as an experience of God. I've oftentimes talked about I do have this ongoing sense of His presence in my life. I feel the presence of God. There's this thing, this sensation that I kind of, that's God is present with me. I feel that. I feel loved by Him. I feel adored by Him. It's like I can almost feel the breath of His nostrils on my back as He's confident with me and going with me through life and through the day. He's right there. I feel that. I sense that. But do I know that that's really the proper and accurate and absolute, incontrovertible explanation for what it is I'm experiencing? As an agnostic, I don't believe that I can know that. I believe it, but I don't know it. I don't know if you can prove there's a God. I don't think you can. I don't believe it can be known. So I don't believe you can prove there is a God. I don't believe you can prove there isn't. I find all the arguments for God to be fallacies. I find all the arguments against the existence of God to have the exact same fallacies. Look, there either is a God or there is not. There's no in between on this. And I don't believe that through knowledge, through scientific inquiry, through nailing it down to the floor in an incontrovertible manner, that we can know this. Right? So it's either one way or the other. I'm comfortable taking the risk of believing that this closeness that I sense, this love that I sense, this presence that I sense is the presence of God. I believe that, and I'm comfortable believing that, and I'm comfortable believing that, having no way of really even proving it. And if somebody doesn't believe me, I don't blame them. I mean, how compelling is that? I have this experience, and I understand it this way. Well, I'm comfortable with that. So that's what I mean when I talk about being agnostic. But when I think about, in some ways, how this worked for others. How about the Apostle Paul? Did the Apostle Paul believe in God? I think he did. In fact, I think that when he's out there killing Christians, he's doing this because he really believes he's doing God's service. Jesus talked about people that would be like that. And Paul is absolutely believing in God. I think it's even interesting to note that in this story about Damascus Road, that Paul actually meets God on the road to Damascus. Not only does he meet God, but Paul knows it's God that he's met. This bright light shine. Paul, it's hard for you to kick against the pricks, And Paul, and Lord, and Paul seems to know immediately that this is God. He seems to know immediately, but he has no clue that it's Jesus. So Paul is a person who believes in God, but isn't really very clear on who Jesus is, on who God is. I think of Peter. Did Peter believe in God? I'm sure Peter believed in God when Jesus first met him. But Jesus walked with his disciples for a number of years, going through various different experiences. And we find that eventually Peter comes to this point where he says, when Jesus gets around to asking, who do people say I am? Who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. That this confession, Peter comes to the point where he realizes who Jesus is. And this was something that wasn't pushed upon him or forced upon him. Nor is it something that he clearly understood, because moments later, he and Jesus are having a little bit of a confrontation. Jesus is saying to the very one who confessed who he is, get behind me, Satan. The point I'm trying to make with this is this. If Paul, supposedly the apostle who wrote so much of this of our faith, and Peter, Some even think he's the first pope. If these are people who either knew Jesus or were around at the beginning of the teaching of the gospel, if these are people who believe in God and yet aren't really totally clear on just, well, who's Jesus? Do we really have, or do we even really need a professional faith? I'm going to say I don't think we do. It is good enough that we have a faith where we relate to God. I said something during the meeting that we had the other day with various people from the New Covenant group. We had a meeting, and I said something that I very much believe. I don't know if I ever said it on the air, but I really don't believe that Christianity was ever intended by Jesus to be a religion that had a set of doctrines and creeds and definitions. In fact, I think that if you were to just try to be honest about some generic sense of who God is, that you would have a more accurate understanding of just who Jesus is than trying to turn him into some, well, he was this Messiah who had to do this and was the gift and the fulfillment of these prophecies and all that, and therefore as the Son of God, he has this authority and all that, trying to put that all into a box. I really think that wasn't the point that even Jesus made. Jesus wanted to make a contact of relationship and connecting. And people ended up believing in him, like the woman at the well. And she wasn't even sure what to think. And she wasn't sure where to worship or what was going on. And at first she wasn't sure, perhaps, if this is really the Messiah or not. But eventually people and she came to evidently believe that. There's a sense in which I think we need to try to get away from this professional faithism and learn to relate to God as a loving presence in our lives, and not worry too much about the particulars, but embrace and abide in that love. Well, that's pretty much all the time we have tonight. I'm glad we had a chance to chat. Thank you for your comments, even early on. And I'll catch you again on Sunday. You take care. This is Bob Greaves, the Unconventional Pastor. See you then.